Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Sam Christiansen, and today we're going to be discussing the community, specifically the state of the community in Colorado Springs. I have guests John Christiansen and Steve Bass, and both are longtime advocates in our community. And Steve, why don't we start with you, introduce yourself and tell us about you.
Hi, I'm Steve Bass. I've been in Colorado Springs for about 21 years now, and throughout that time I've been involved in various community efforts, mostly having to do with civil rights and subsistence type stuff. I've given away a lot of food and that sort of thing in this town, and now I'm working with Acorn.
Great, thank you. And John, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Hi, I'm John Christiansen. I guess I'm a longtime Springs resident too. I've been living here for about 15 years off and on, but for the past 5 years or so I've been an advocate and an activist as well. I've mostly worked on things like understanding global trade issues and student organizing and anti-war stuff, and now I'm working with Acorn as a community organizer.
Thank you. So before we start talking about Colorado Springs and the state of the community in Colorado Springs, I wonder if one of you could just kind of review for me or go over just a little description of maybe the city and some of the stereotypes that the city is hit with, so we know where we're all kind of coming from on this.
That's on me. Well, the perception of Colorado Springs that I've been able to gather from sources outside of the city are just probably the same as what people are already aware of. My family back in Cleveland and other people that I've talked to sees Colorado Springs as a real conservative city. You hear the term right-wing kook every once in a while, and I have to argue that there are some moderate folks out here as well. There's a lot of military here, so therefore there's obviously going to be that influence, and it's true that El Paso County and Colorado Springs in particular is a Republican stronghold. The voting records demonstrate that, and our the people who hold positions of authority in this city are by and large Republican and lean towards the right. Right.
I think that's pretty much in line with what those of us that live here and those of us that have family elsewhere or that have friends elsewhere hear the perception of our city as sort of a conservative place. But, I'm glad that you mentioned that there is, in fact, quite a progressive community here, and it's building and it's affecting change, which is part of what we're doing here, is providing a resource and providing a venue for progressive ideas. But, John, tell us about being an organizer in Colorado Springs. What do you do? You can address sort of the technical aspects of your job, and then if you'd like to cater that specifically to something Steve just mentioned about the environment itself as well.
Well, it is kind of interesting being an organizer, a community organizer in Colorado Springs, because Colorado Springs does have this conservative reputation, and it's also a newer Western type city with we don't have like traditional urban enclaves, like urban ethnic enclaves and everything. So it is a little different from sort of traditional community organizing where you can go straight into the inner city and work with somewhat homogenous groups of people to organize. So in Colorado Springs, you really, I feel like, have to go in and hit on issues specifically, and you may not be able to use a lot of like the familiar rhetoric that community organizers are used to using, like just general collective action type rhetoric. You have to go in there, and you do have to realize that the people that you're working with aren't necessarily like urban dwellers and aren't familiar with a lot of the ideas of collective action. But it's still community organizing though, and it's not really, it's sort of the same, I guess, everywhere it goes or everywhere people do it, that we're trying to go into communities that have historically been underrepresented or marginalized or disempowered, and we're trying to help them empower themselves and help them have representation in the city. And like I said, a lot of times it is just a matter of sort of working on these specific sort of narrow things to get people just interested, but eventually the idea is to get the community to think collectively about their collective self-interest.
Do you have anything to add to that, Steve? Or
well, I have noticed that it kind of, in the level that John's talking about, when we go into neighborhoods, there are, Republicans and Democrats, and it's not homogeneous at all. There are all manner of diversity amongst the Acorn members, that what we've got experience with. And it really does boil down to issues, because when it comes to whether or not there's a park in the neighborhood or whether there are enough, say, police services or whatever, it has little to do with a person's political party. It's just a matter of on-the-ground issues.
Right. Well, and that leads right to where I wanted to go with this next, which is that since you're out in the community and you're talking to different people, just what are some examples of issues that are motivating people, that are causing people either to get organized or that are even just concerns that people have in our city? What are the community concerns? I'll open it up to either of you.
Well, this community concern that we've really been working on lately is the parks issue, and what we've discovered working within the neighborhood and discovered doing research, Acorn itself doing research, is that a lot of the park amenities or open space amenities, things like that, quality of life amenities, I guess, are sort of concentrated up north and the newer areas of Colorado Springs, north and east and everything, in the south and east part of town don't have as many of those things. We've really been working in the wildflower community on getting a park built for them, because for the last 30 years it's been sitting empty. And the Stratmore Valley is also working on getting a park because they don't have a park. And there's issues like they've been working on getting streetlights, which is another issue, and wildflower things like having a police presence in the neighborhood. Those are pretty common. Neighborhood watch is something that a lot of people are interested in here. Simple sort of issues like that, but issues that aren't really being taken care of by the city.
You want to add to that?
Sure. I'll mention the school districts, which we've been hearing a lot from members and almost members about. We plan on involving ourselves in at least the District 11 race, to the extent of providing forums for candidates if possible. And what else? We've developed a liaison with the Colorado College now to help distribute free food on Sundays, which we'll see where that leads. Right now we're just giving away food, but we'll see what sort of interest we can gather from those people, and possibly set up some financial literacy classes or whatever, feed that through the Urban League who we work with. All sorts of things.
Great. Well, one thing I'm really interested in talking about is the idea of issue-based organizing, as opposed to this traditional model that you're talking about earlier, John, of a neighborhood. And what I'm curious about is, as you are entering into an area that has a common geographic element, are you finding that the issues are also common, or is it segmented? Do you find that people are coming together to organize over different issues, but there's enough of, there's maybe 3 groups that have issues or 4 groups that have issues? Do they interact, or are people generally interested in their own issue? I guess what I'm boiling this down to is, how much solidarity is there among people in issue-based organizing?
That's actually a good question. That's sort of something that you have to deal with issue-based organizing, is that, like in the Wildflower neighborhood, for example, they're organizing around the park, they're organizing around a development that's coming into their neighborhood, and they're organizing around neighborhood watch, and there is overlap. And in the bigger picture, you sort of realize there is some overlap in, like what we were talking about with just amenities in general on the southeast side. But there is a sense that it is sort of harder to build solidarity or collective consciousness among the whole neighborhood if they're just focused on their individual issues. And part of our job, I think, as organizers, is to help them see or understand that like these issues are all actually interrelated, and that there's the neighborhood, the edge of the part of town, are being ignored for class or race reasons or whatever. So that's a thing that we need to start working on, is helping them understand that it's like it is about a park and it is about a development, but it's also the fact that there's this whole area in general is having to deal with underrepresentation or whatever, or marginalization. So, but it is definitely difficult for people to sort of step outside that very narrow focus or whatever.
It seems like that would be one of the major challenges, because in some ways you're catering to individuals, and then in turn turning to create a community out of that. What are some other challenges that you guys have faced going into neighborhoods? I guess what it boils down to is when you're talking to someone about whether or not their community is organized, do you get resistance from that, or are people pretty responsive, and what are the barriers that you find, other than, I guess, just uninterested?
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest barrier, is that people have a hard time seeing the group as being to their self-interest or whatever. So a lot of people just in general aren't interested. They don't see necessarily that it's going to help them specifically, or they might assume that somebody else can do it and it'll get taken care of. So that's a big problem. But there's always just like the sort of typical things that you have to deal with like personality conflict or whatever, which is just something that I guess part of human nature. Some people just aren't going to get along necessarily. But there's also the issues of people that are in leadership roles that aren't used to being in leadership roles. There's issues of like people coming from different cultures, different backgrounds, different races, and everything that are, that people have to realize, this is a modern sort of suburban city. It's very diverse in many ways or whatever. So those are issues that you have to just the United States in general has to work with, like understanding multiculturalism, that it's sort of like we're all supposed to be working together or whatever, rather than against each other.
Did you have anything to add? Or?
Sure. I can't really add too much to what John said just then. I mean, we've come across all those things. There's been instances of racism and that sort of thing. But I think that we've pretty much, that's something difficult to address, because it's difficult to change the mind of a bigot. I think that for the most part, my inclination is to just let that particular bigot stay in his yard and do his thing. Some of these issue-oriented, when we go to address issues, like for example, the renter thing, we've been working with Mike Merrifield and Cindy Culp's track to develop landlord tenant legislation that allows tenants some rights and defines the responsibility of landlords and that sort of thing. Now, when you get on the ground in the neighborhoods, and I don't know what the numbers are, but I think Wildflower is about half and half, renters and homeowners. The homeowners are perturbed with the renters because they perceive the renters as slovenly or whatever. The renters are, for the most part, bound because their landlords are either out of town, don't give a hoot, they make a phone call, can't do anything about the bad siding, the paint job, that sort of thing. And the trick for us is to enable the homeowners to realize that this is a neighborhood issue and not just an issue to bicker over with their neighbors, so that they can get behind the potential for reforming some legislation and getting something done.
So it kind of seems like, on one hand, we've been discussing issue-based organizing as something that can be a bit of a barrier or a challenge, but then, Steve, I think you're bringing up a good point that in some ways it's also just a matter of how you're looking at it, because these are broad issues and they do apply to everyone, and in fact, these issues are able to help transcend the movement outside of a neighborhood to neighborhood group.
It kind of pertains to the school district issue too. Everybody wants better schools, and the argument comes over how to go about that.
Right. So to change gears slightly just and move on to a question that I'm interested in as people working with communities, you are also working with more traditional power institutions. You're working with elected officials, you're working with traditional institutions of power such as school boards and et cetera. And what has the response been like? Are these, certainly the concept of a community organization is nothing new, but a powerful community organization in Colorado Springs is kind of new, and certainly an aggressive one. So I'm interested in hearing either specific anecdotes, if you'd like to share them, or even just generally, what's the reaction been? Has it been positive, negative, a little bit of both?
I would have to say, I guess it's a little bit of both. We've had positive interactions with representatives from the city to the state to the county level when we're sort of doing things that aren't really like too much, you know, stepping on their toes or opposed to their ideology or whatever. But once we start working on issues that maybe they're not 100% in agreement with, or that, you know, they're having a hard time seeing things from the same angle, we've very much had some sort of contentious relationships, I guess, with some officials. So it's just sort of hard to say. In fact, there's a saying, though, with community organizing, no permanent allies and no permanent enemies. I don't know, I guess you have to work with that, because it's a good idea, because if you just want to focus on getting things done at that specific time for this specific group of people. So to just totally alienate some officials because you don't like them or whatever would be hard if, when, you know, once you've moved into another neighborhood and you really need them. So it's just the idea of working with them when you can and raising hell with them, you know, when they're opposed to you. So.
Well, I really haven't come across any situation where there was a lot of opposition. And up to this point, of course, I've only been working with Acorn for a couple of months now, but up to this point, you know, John has been the one that cut all the flack, and once whichever officials are involved have realized that they needed to pay attention to what we were doing, why they get pretty agreeable pretty quickly. So.
And I wonder, and maybe that's what I'm truthfully guiding towards, is getting you to acknowledge or talk to me about essentially the power of organized people. When you are, certainly all of us have worked in the political system in terms of at least interacting with it, but it's a very different game when suddenly you're representing a group of people, a neighborhood organization. It seems to me, based on my own experience and observation, that, as you're saying, the reaction's quite different when suddenly you're mentioning a neighborhood group of 100 people. There's a real difference, and without belaboring the issue, just am curious if you've had the same experience, if it was different when you worked as just an individual, as both of you are longtime advocates in the community. Is it different approaching them as a representative of a neighborhood group?
Well, sure. I don't think any of the three of us or any individual could possibly have even gotten the Parks Department to notice that we needed a park over there in Wildflower that's been sitting there for 30 years undeveloped without some sort of backing from a large group of people, basically what it is. Okay. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, one guy saying we need a park is not going to get on the evening news, and all of that stuff has played a part in the effectiveness of the organization. You know, as far as actual face-to-face dealings with officials, I don't know that I personally have had any revelatory experiences or anything, because most of the people that I've dealt with I know already. So,
do you have anything to add?
I guess I would just say that, yeah, I think that's our idea. The idea with Acorn is to build people power, to build a mass movement. So that's sort of the thing. Your political representatives are supposed to be answerable to the people, and when they see a lot of people, they realize that, oh crap, this is my constituency. They have the power to vote me in or out, or to embarrass me in the media, like you said. So it is powerful, building people power.
And then I'm also interested in some of the dynamics within the neighborhood group. We talked a little bit about the conflict in the group, but I'm also interested just in the changes that occur maybe on issues of entitlement or empowerment. Certainly we all know that a neighborhood group is empowering. We've witnessed that through our work here, but have you noticed any changes in individuals or changes in people's perceptions perhaps of what they see as a possibility?
I kind of think I have in just a short period. It's amazing that it doesn't take very long for people to start getting that sense of entitlement or that sense of empowerment, that it's like it's just a matter of weeks, really. It seems like that you start discussing the issues and they start realizing that other people have the same issues. It is empowering to be like, well, okay, I'm not just a crazy individual that thinks that this one little thing is, it's just a pet peeve or whatever. It's like a lot of people's pet peeves. And there's, I guess, this sense that, like, well, if everybody else is mad, I can actually call, a representative about it. I can do something about it. And it's really, I've seen people really develop different sorts of personalities in the community organization, I feel like. So it is really, an empowering tool, I guess.
Would you say that overall you've witnessed it being and this is again my own thoughts on it, and I'm looking for either agreement or disagreement, that it seems that even though the effects of a community organization are clear, there's a positive effect in the community, but that there are in fact positive effects on individuals as well, positive effects.
I definitely agree actually with that. Sometimes it's hard, sometimes individuals get frustrated or upset, but I think overall individuals do feel empowered and whatnot. So
add to that, Steve? I didn't mean to jump in on you.
I guess we're running short of time, but I'll say at least that it's common parlance, and everyone seems to agree that Americans have grown quite apathetic. I think the reason that they're apathetic is because they feel like nothing they do makes any difference. And by golly, we've seen some results just in the short time that we've been working for Acorn, the three of us, and that is what changes people from being apathetic to feeling empowered, to where they will get up and do something and collect themselves into a meeting, an organization, make a phone call to a city official or whatever. I think that's what it is. We've managed to produce some results, and therefore people are feeling empowered.
That's good. Which leads to really kind of a summary question that I would like you to use the opportunity to add in anything that we haven't talked about in terms of the community organizing model or structure or effects. But overall, you've been working in communities, you've been working on issues organizing, neighborhood organizing. Do you feel like there's a change taking place? Do you feel that there's a movement occurring? Is there understanding that it's a long process, but are you certainly you're still in the game, so you're not completely pessimistic about it, but just your thoughts on that and where maybe where you think it's going.
Well, Acorn is an association of community organizations, and we've got 2 chapters in Colorado Springs. So yeah, I think we've got some inertia going right now. We've got a smallish base, and the object is to continue to build community organizations and cause them to associate. And I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but
it's okay.
We're going to take over the universe. That's what.
Right.
We're going to build community organizations until there is a perceived power amongst all of the organizations, and until when the folks see that there's a good reason to associate their community organizations, I think that'll be another threshold that we can cross.
Right.
I sort of agree with that. Like, I guess the Acorn model I agree with. Working with them, the idea of growing small chapters and bringing that to the next level, the city chapter, then the state level, then the national level, because we have sort of organizations at each level or whatever, and I do think that that's going to be powerful. I think it has sort of changed legislation on the local level. I would like to see more of it actually going upwards, actual grassroots movement upwards with sort of legislation or whatever. But just the more and more we're out in the press, the more and more we're talking, about people power and about working people and working people's movement, that's hopefully changing the way people think about issues. too. You know, we've for so long, I mean, especially in the past 4 years, we've been thinking in much different sort of terms in this country. So I really want to get to that point where we're thinking about issues like how is this affecting people where they live and how they live. So
Great. Well, in summary, I think that, you know, the work that you guys are doing, that Acorn is doing, is overdue in the community, but certainly not too late. And I think that you guys, without, you know, stroking your egos, I think you should be proud of what you're doing. And I think it's good work, and I think you're doing it with a good organization. Obviously, I'm a part of that organization, so I'm biased in my assessment. But there is a perception that Colorado Springs is almost unsalvageable among some people, and I'm happy to see that that is diminishing. There is a real sense, I believe, that the people are coming together in the city, and I would say in a larger part in the country, to sort of recreate the ideas of democracy. And I think community organizing, grassroots community organizing, is as close to democracy as it gets. And so I'd like to just wrap up on that thought that grassroots organizing is democracy. And thank everybody for watching our show, and encourage anyone with any comments to please send them, and encourage anyone, you know, that wants more information to just continue to follow our show, to follow our organization, and to be in contact. And again, thank you guys both for being here, and with that, I think we will say goodnight.
I'm out. Peace.